If it's okay, maybe I'll get started, because the presentation today is actually not that visual. I'm really trying to focus on some what I hope are fairly simple ideas here. So hopefully it'll make sense with just me going over the ideas, and when things get fixed up, we'll put it up here. I'm also going to make my slides available after the presentation, so maybe we can just jump into it and just see how it goes. Okay. Well, thank you very much for coming today. I'm also going to stick pretty close to some notes that I have here, so that I keep on the right timeline. Otherwise, I tend to talk a bit too much. So my plan is to talk for 20 minutes about this topic. I also need my glasses. And you can't see my title, but the title of the presentation is A New Focus for Evaluating ESOL Teaching: Students' End-of-Course Preparedness to Transfer Learning. So I'm really looking forward to hearing any ideas that you might have about this afterwards. Like I say, I'll post the slides and a recording, and but with that in mind, we'll jump into it. So the description in the program for today said this. I'm just going to read this briefly, and this gives us an overview of what we're going to talk about today. A goal of ESOL teaching is students' transfer of learning beyond ESOL classrooms. Evaluating this is challenging because of difficulty in tracking students after an ESOL course. An alternative, practical perspective is to focus on whether students at the end of an ESOL course are prepared to transfer learning. So this idea of focusing on ESOL students' preparedness to transfer learning is, as far as I can tell, it's a new idea. So I'll go step by step through these points in detail, and we'll take a look at concrete examples of how we can do this. So I'm hoping that by the end of the presentation, you will have a good understanding of what transfer preparedness means and why it might be useful to focus on it. And we'll look at some concrete ways that you might make use of this idea. So that's the plan. We'll start by taking a look at the first point that I just mentioned, that a goal of ESOL teaching is students' transfer of learning beyond the ESOL classroom. Transfer of learning is a label that comes from psychology to describe the application of learning in new situations. For example, if I know how to drive a car and I try to drive a truck for the first time, I might transfer some of my car driving skills. Hopefully I transfer some of my car driving skills to this new vehicle. Learning transfer has been one of the most widely studied topics in psychology, and the research goes back for well over 100 years. Learning transfer is also a very practical concern because it's a basic purpose of any education or training program or course. I'll keep going, I'll step over here. So it's a basic goal of any education or training program or course, including ESOL, right? Including TESOL. In other words, students should be able to take whatever they learn in any program or course and apply it outside that program or course in the real world. If students can't do that, the value of that program or course seems questionable. So in an ESOL course, students should be able to transfer whatever they learn to situations outside the course. And in this way, learning transfer is a fundamental goal of ESOL teaching. Now, it's often assumed in education and training contexts that learning will transfer. For example, if students do well on a test in our class, we might assume that they will transfer that learning when they're outside the class, in a different course, or when they go home, or at work. But research on learning transfer has often shown that learning doesn't necessarily transfer, and it can be very difficult to stimulate. So in an ESOL course, just because students do well in class doesn't mean that they will necessarily transfer that learning when they leave the class. They might, but there are all sorts of things that can get in the way. So because transfer is such an important goal in ESOL education, and because learning doesn't necessarily lead to transfer, then ideally, with every ESOL course, the teacher would be able to see if the course actually does lead to transfer. This kind of information would be great feedback for the teacher. For example, helping with future decisions about the most effective kinds of materials and activities. And this kind of information could be really useful to curriculum developers and to researchers too. Unfortunately, there's a big problem here. To figure out if an ESOL course leads to transfer, we have to track students after they leave the course. and that can be very difficult. For example, if I'm teaching an English for academic purposes course to international students in their first year of study at a US university, and I'm expecting that learning will transfer to the students' courses throughout their 4 years of study, I have to figure out a way to track the students so that I get a clear idea of whether learning has transferred throughout those 4 years. And if I'm teaching a more general kind of ESOL course, I might be expecting that learning will transfer to any future English activity, not just at school, but also at work, at home, and for recreation. Tracking students across this wide range of contexts could be even more difficult. This difficulty is reflected in the way that research studies that have been designed to investigate learning transfer in ESOL education. With those studies, they've often involved gathering data from students while they're in an ESOL course and for months or years afterwards. So I said a minute ago that ideally, with every ESOL course, the teacher would be able to see if the course leads to transfer. But teachers often can't do this because we don't have the time or resources to track students sufficiently. If I had a slide, you'd see that we have a possible solution. But you're just going to have to take my word for it. Okay. But there is a possible solution. Rather than tracking students after they leave an ESOL course to see if learning actually transfers, we could examine at the end of an ESOL course whether the students are prepared to transfer learning. This means taking a different perspective. Rather than waiting until some time and place in the future to look backwards at whether students have transferred learning, rather this means looking forwards from within the ESOL course to see if students are prepared for future transfer opportunities. And because we could figure this out within an ESOL course before students leave, it wouldn't involve any tracking of students. So this would be a practical way for ESOL teachers, curriculum developers, and researchers to look at ESOL courses from a transfer perspective. So if we want to examine students' transfer preparedness at the end of an ESOL course, how might we do this? Well, transfer preparedness is technically a new concept, and it hasn't been looked at yet in any published research, so we need to come up with a definition that we can use. I think we can create a useful definition by drawing together key ideas from research on learning transfer. So what I'll do here is present a definition, and then we'll talk about each of the parts in a little more detail, and that will help us to see how we can use this definition. So I think that we can define transfer preparedness like this. At the end of an ESOL course, being prepared to transfer means that a student A, learned something transferable in the course, B, learned it in ways that facilitate transfer, C, is motivated to transfer this learning, and D, knows how to deal with unsupportive transfer climates. The first part of that definition is that the students learned something that is transferable in the course. That's fairly straightforward. I mean, the idea is fairly straightforward. Just because someone learns something does not mean that what they learned is useful, transferable. An example of this is all the trivia floating around in my head that I've learned over the years that I probably will never use. Or in an ESOL class, perhaps I teach my students rare vocabulary that they will likely never see again outside the classroom. If that's what my students are learning in my class, they won't be very well prepared to transfer learning. The second part of the definition is that the student learned in ways that facilitate transfer. This is important because some ways of learning are better than others at facilitating transfer. One way of learning that works well is learning in a situation that resembles target situations. For example, if I'm teaching an English for engineering purposes course, I can have students use authentic engineering materials and do genuine engineering activities, like designing or building something in my class. A second way of learning that works well for facilitating transfer is learning that involves thinking abstractly and making connections. For example, in my English for engineering purposes course, I can ask students to think about abstract principles of engineering communication, like principles of writing technical reports or principles of giving technical presentations. And I can ask students to think about specific situations in which they could use these principles. Learning in these ways will help ESOL students to be prepared to transfer that learning. The third part of the definition is that the student is motivated to transfer learning. This is important because there are two main ways that transfer can occur. One way is automatically. For example, when I get into a car that I've never driven before, I automatically transfer my driving ability because the new car has all sorts of similarities to all the other cars I've driven: steering wheel, pedals, indicators, and so on. Because this kind of transfer is automatic, motivation doesn't have much of a role here. On the other hand, the second way that transfer occurs is deliberately, and motivation plays a big role here. For example, when I'm driving through heavy traffic, I might think to myself, what's the best way to drive through this? And I deliberately think back to a documentary that I saw last week about how traffic jams work. And I might try to use some of the ideas from that documentary to navigate my way through traffic. Motivation is important here because if I'm not motivated to find a solution to that heavy traffic problem, and if I don't want to make the mental effort to try to recollect what I saw in the documentary, transfer won't happen. In the example of my English for Engineering Purposes course, if my students are not motivated to transfer what they learned about writing technical reports and giving technical presentations, then when they leave my course, they won't make an effort to transfer learning. So the deliberate kind of transfer won't happen. So being motivated to transfer learning is an important part of their transfer preparedness. And finally, the fourth part of the definition is that students know how to deal with unsupportive transfer climates. Transfer climate here refers to the transfer support that someone perceives in a target situation. A lot of the research on transfer climate has been done in workplace training contexts. And the transfer climate is the transfer support that an employee who has been through a training program perceives from their supervisors and their coworkers, as well as rewards like raises and promotions that they expect if they transfer learning. We can apply this to ESOL education. When students leave an ESOL classroom, they might perceive varying transfer support from people they interact with and varying rewards for transferring learning. A vivid illustration of this is an undergraduate engineering student I interviewed for a research study. This student was taking an EAP course as part of his engineering program, and he told me that one of his engineering professors said that EAP courses are a waste of time. So this student was experiencing an unsupportive transfer climate. And you can imagine that as a result, the student was probably reluctant to try to transfer learning from the EAP course to that particular engineering course. So knowing what to do when there is an unsupportive transfer climate like this will help ESOL students to be prepared to transfer learning. So that gives us a working definition that we can use to try to figure out at the end of an ESOL course if students are prepared to transfer learning. So the practical question now is how can we do this? How exactly do we do this? The bad news is that because this is a new concept, there aren't any ready-made solutions. So we have to find or create solutions. But that's good news too, because it means there's plenty of flexibility and room for creativity. So we can get the ball rolling here by taking a look at some possible practical approaches. I'll describe a couple of general approaches that I think could be useful. First, in some ESOL contexts, it might make sense to use a holistic, qualitative approach for examining students' transfer preparedness. For example, at the end of an ESOL course, a teacher might interview students and ask simply whether the students think that they are prepared to transfer learning and how they know. How do they know this? This could be done individually or perhaps as a small group or a whole class discussion. This could also be done as a writing assignment. Besides giving the teacher a basis for judging whether students are prepared to transfer learning, the open-ended nature of this approach would allow the teacher to see if the student's responses fit with the 4 parts of that definition that we've just described, or if their responses suggest that there are other aspects of transfer preparedness besides those 4 parts of that definition that we need to think about. Confirming or developing that definition further would be helpful to all of us as teachers, curriculum developers, and researchers. And the second main way that I think we could approach this is, in some ESOL contexts, it might make sense to take a more analytic, deductive, quantitative approach to examine students' transfer preparedness. This would involve gathering information related to each of the 4 parts of that definition of transfer preparedness. So the first part, we want to assess whether students have learned something transferable in the course. We could give students a questionnaire that asks what they think they've learned in the course, or we could give students a test to see what they've learned. So some maybe more traditional ways that we can start that off. For the second part of the definition, to assess whether students have learned in ways that facilitate transfer, we could, again, give the students a questionnaire that asks about the kinds of activities they did in the ESOL course. For example, whether they think that those activities resemble situations outside the course, or whether those activities got them to think abstractly and make connections. Or we could give the students a test that involves transfer tasks. In other words, tasks that the students have not encountered before and that are similar to tasks that they would do outside an ESOL classroom. For the third part of the definition, to assess whether students are motivated to transfer, we could give the students a questionnaire that focuses on their transfer motivation. For example, with items that ask if they want to transfer what they've learned, and if they will make an effort, if they intend to try to transfer what they've learned. And for the fourth part of the definition, to assess whether students know how to deal with unsupportive transfer climates, we could give the students a questionnaire that asks if they think that they are able to deal with unsupportive transfer climates. Or we could give the students a test that simulates unsupportive transfer climates and see how the students deal with it. So those are the 2 main ways that I think at the moment I'm thinking that we could approach examining students' transfer preparedness at the end of an ESOL course. But these need to be developed much more. Wrapping things up now, that's it. As I mentioned, I'm going to put the slides that you didn't get to enjoy today on a website. And just to summarize, and I'll put a recording too, I'm recording as I'm speaking. To summarize what we've covered, I started off with a statement. It's from the conference program that describes what we were going to be covering today. A goal of ESOL teaching is students' transfer of learning beyond ESOL classrooms. Evaluating this is challenging because of difficulty in tracking students after an ESOL course. An alternative, practical perspective is to focus on whether students at the end of an ESOL course are prepared to transfer learning. That's what I was trying to cover, so I hope we've that's been clear enough for you. Looking ahead from here, I'm hoping that we can come up with more concrete tools and procedures that can be used by ESOL teachers, curriculum developers, and researchers to examine students' transfer preparedness. It is quite difficult to figure out if ESOL teaching leads to actual learning transfer, and that's a shame because learning transfer is such an important goal in what we're trying to do. I think that if there are easier ways to look at ESOL teaching from a transfer perspective, this might lead to more ESOL teachers, curriculum developers, and researchers actually looking at ESOL teaching from a transfer perspective, and that will help us to learn more about how to meet this important goal in ESOL education. That's it. Thanks, everybody. I should check time here. I know that we've got, I think I was supposed to finish right about now. Is there another presentation in here? I didn't. In here, no. 11 starts the keynote. Gotcha. Well, please. So we're all done. If anyone wants to go, it's fine. And I'm happy to stick around for a few minutes and answer any questions. I will post this on my website, which is www.drmajames, drmajames.info, info. www.drmajames.info. And I'll have that up there in the next few days. Thanks, everybody. I appreciate it. Thank you. If you have any thoughts about transfer preparedness, I'd love to hear from you by email, or if you're able to stick around, or contact me by email, whatever. I'd love to hear more about this because it is an idea that I'm trying to sort of work with. So yeah. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, good.
Another field to
Yeah.
yeah.